Turbos. Turbos suck, and make more. Even if you know practically nothing about them, you still know that turbo means power. Everyone knows that if it has a turbo, then it's the best at whatever it is. You're watching DA Garage. Welcome. Thanks for stopping by. Question: what's cooler than motorcycles? Motorcycles with turbos. Factory-produced turbo bikes are very uncommon, but there was a short snippet of time when the Japanese Big Four tried their hand at making turbo motorcycles. Sounds awesome, right? It is. However, there were a plethora of problems and difficulties that arose when these manufacturers tried to produce them. Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Suzuki all tried, but ended up ditching the turbos after just a few short years. In this video, I'll be going over the quick rise and the quick fall of the turbo bikes, why it even happened, and why it went away. For the Japanese, the 80s was the hotbed for rapid technological advancement. If you want to see how exciting of a time that was for motorcycle development, then you need to check out my other video, The Forgotten Golden Era of Motorcycles, after you finish watching this one, of course. Link in the description. Turbocharging is not a new technology. It's been around for well over 100 years. However, it didn't find its way into a mass-produced car until the 60s.
And the turbocharger whirls at incredible speed, and that enormous surge of jet fire power.
And finally became slightly more mainstream in the 70s, though not by much. Then the 80s rolled around, and it's time for motorcycle manufacturers to tinker with turbos on their bikes. This sort of thing was destined to happen at some point, and the early 80s was just the perfect time for it. The big push for turbo bikes came when then US President Ronald Reagan imposed massive tariffs on Japanese motorcycles with over 700cc displacement.
You asked us to give you breathing room so you could finish getting into shape to meet unexpectedly strong foreign competition.
Even besides that, turbos on motorcycles is an interesting prospect. The possibility of making a 650 with the power of a 1000. What happens when you have a little 500cc engine and stick a turbo on it? Well, not much until you reach high RPM, then boom, it feels sudden and jarring. Quickly, you begin to doubt your life choices because you don't feel in control anymore. Enter the Honda CX500 Turbo, a bike from the future with unbelievable technology and one big, glaring problem. Honda wasn't technically the first to slap a turbo on their bike, but they were the first to offer a factory mass-produced turbo motorcycle, and the CX500 Turbo was it. The engine was borrowed from their plain old CX500, a transverse V-twin. Modifications had to be done to make it suitable for a turbo.
Smallest turbocharger in the world.
But that was so much easier to do rather than create a whole new engine. This fine machine was the first motorcycle to use Honda's PGM-FI,
systematically controlled by a digital computer.
Honda's programmable fuel injection. Fuel injection on an 80s motorcycle? Yup. That was a big first and a big deal. The CX500 Turbo was a masterpiece. Or was it? The styling was amazing, the features and technology was futuristic, the build quality and reliability was typical excellent Honda. So why did this bike fall flat and only be produced for 1 year? It had one pitfall, and that one thing is significant enough to scare riders off this otherwise spectacular machine. The culprit? Turbo lag. On the surface, that might not seem like much of an issue, but when riding, it's a very big deal. Put simply, turbo lag is when you accelerate slowly due to a lack of power, then suddenly thrust forward from loads of power once the turbo spools up. As you can imagine, riding a motorcycle with bursts of hard-to-control power isn't a good thing, especially if you're in a corner when the boost kicks in. Sure, the downfall of this CX500 Turbo is only due to one thing, but when that one thing is significant enough, that's all it takes. James Bond rode this bike in the movie Never Say Never Again. No doubt 007 rode the coolest motorcycle of its time, but of course, Mr. Bond had some extra special features on his bike, like rockets, turbo rockets. It shouldn't come as any surprise that the Yamaha XJ650 Seika Turbo doesn't actually come equipped with rocket boosters. Us plebeians only got a turbo on this two-wheeled machine, but a turbo is plenty exciting enough. In 1982 and 83, Yamaha created their version of a futuristic turbo bike. However, it was built with dated parts and ideas. The Honda was built for the future, while the Yamaha only looked like it. Yamaha hoped that the radical and exciting styling would sell the bike, because the internals sure wouldn't. They made some lackluster decisions while creating this motorcycle, which ultimately culminated in an odd and underwhelming bike. The XJ Turbo was built on a Seika chassis, a chassis that desperately needed to be beefed up. Pressurized CV carburetors, oil and air cooling, and finally a strangely placed rear-mounted turbo. A hot little rear tire warmer, if you will. The placement of the turbo was destined for failure, as it got no cool air back there. In fact, it just got hot, stagnant air from the already hot engine. The icing on the cake was that the long and complex turbo piping that made for some atrocious turbo lag. Writers have said that this bike delivers no power as you twist the throttle, then wham! All the power slams you forward as the frame distorts and the handlebars shake. Yamaha made this two-wheeled science experiment for only 2 years before realizing it had no potential and very few sales. Non-turbo XJs continued strong while the turbo variant was never seen of again. The Honda CX650 Turbo. I'm going to be incredibly brief with this one because it's very similar to the Honda CX500 Turbo that was previously mentioned. It's pretty much just a better version of the CX500 Turbo. Built on the same platform, the CX650 Turbo's engine is bored and stroked up to 675cc with higher compression than the 500. A little bit of suspension tuning also helped the already good handling platform perform even better. Sounds pretty sweet, right? It gets better. The higher compression and larger engine size help reduce turbo lag. Great. Well, almost. It still didn't entirely eliminate the lag, just reduced its effects a little bit. The 650 also got a cool red and blue color scheme, making it look more modern. Honda put in a great deal of effort to make their motorcycles the best on the market, and while the CX650 Turbo was a supremely advanced bike, it still wasn't the answer that customers were looking for. Only a limited 1,777 units were ever produced. Suzuki, being part of the big Japanese four, couldn't miss out on the turbo bike craze, so they created their own, and it was a doozy. Suzuki's engineers and designers have created some iconic and timeless bikes over the decades. However, on the day that the engineers were designing their turbo bike, the XN85, they must have been on crack. Nothing about this motorcycle made sense. How bad could it be? Well, Suzuki wishes they could sweep it under the rug and have us all forget about this one. Like a little brother, Suzuki didn't want to be left out of the turbo bike action, so they hopped in with their katana-styled motorcycle called the XN85 because it made 85 horsepower. Little brother Suzuki had the ability to make a good boosted machine, but they rushed this bike and it's a mess of a design. Mainly in the genius decision of its turbo placement. It's generally understood to keep your turbos cool, and in the days before intercoolers, engineers would place the turbos in a spot that got air cooling or had lower ambient temperatures. So what on earth was Suzuki thinking when they stuffed their turbo behind the cylinders above the gearbox in an itty bitty little space that gets no airflow? It was so bad that the turbos would seize. Well, just get a new replacement turbo. Its naturally aspirated motorcycle sibling, the GSX750S, was lighter, faster, cheaper, less complicated, and much more reliable than the XN85. So what's the point in buying the turbo bike? Today these bikes are very rare, but that wasn't on purpose. They sold very poorly because they were so expensive, unreliable, and while the performance was decent, it wasn't enough to compensate for all of its flaws. Unfortunately for Suzuki, the XN was a blemish on their motorcycle crafting history, and that's why they'd like us all to forget about it. Mr. Kawasaki definitely had his work cut out for himself ever since building his first motorcycle. From the lightning-quick two-stroke bikes of the 60s and 70s, to the famous GPZ750R, to today with the insane H2, Kawasaki has always been on the cutting edge of technology and wild performance. To those Kawi fans out there, you'll be glad to hear that Kawasaki's rendition of the turbo bike was a success. And out of the big four, the GPZ750 Turbo was probably the best option. The GPZ750 Turbo may have been the last turbo bike to join the club, but that was probably to everyone's benefit. Kawasaki took the time to flesh out a proper motorcycle, rather than rush a complicated mess on two wheels out to market. First off, Kawasaki went with a front-mounted turbo, which is great for two big reasons. One, it gets adequate airflow and cooling. Two, shorter turbo headers equals quicker exhaust flow, thus reducing turbo lag. Aside from the turbo, Kawi also created a well-planned bike. It didn't look like it was trying too hard to appear futuristic. Rather, it was simply modern, sporty, and functional. It handled pretty well too. Turbo lag was minimal, and once the swirly boy spooled up, this Kawasaki turned into a rocket. It was fast, and I mean really fast. Our favorite drag strip ace, J. Pee Wee Gleason,
I've broken everything except my neck and my back.
blasted through the quarter mile in 10.7 seconds on one of these. Record-smashing speed back then, and still extremely impressive today, 40 years later. As mentioned earlier, Kawasaki knows how to make a proper motorcycle, and their turbo attempt was no exception. Even in uncharted waters, they dominated the competition. The turbo bikes of the early 80s was definitely a fascinating, though brief period of time. It was bound to happen at some point, and this moment in time was just the right time for it. Technology had advanced enough where putting a turbo on a motorcycle was a viable option. The Reagan administration put restrictions on larger Japanese motorcycle imports, so sticking a turbo on a smaller bike to produce more power just made sense. Tariff busters is what they were called. After an incredibly short 2 years, turbo bikes were no more. Why? Technology was advancing so rapidly that during the turbo bike era, naturally aspirated bikes were also getting much faster. Not only were the NA bikes getting faster, but they were much easier and cheaper to produce, lighter in weight, handled better, and were much less complex and more reliable. Looking at it that way, you see how continuing to produce turbo motorcycles just doesn't make much sense. Then a few years after that, and the Reagan administration lifted the tariffs. Now you know why the turbo bike era burst into existence and then fizzled out almost as fast as it started. In some ways, it seems almost a shame that these motorcycle manufacturers went through so much cost and trouble to develop these turbo bikes that ultimately failed and faded into history. I suppose the silver lining here is that lessons were learned and knowledge advances. Don't forget to check out my other videos. If you like this one, you're definitely going to like the other ones that I have. Thank you so much for watching, and if you feel so inclined, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you. See you later.